Your fantasy team might need some improvement. Even if you got the best team in your league, you need to strengthen it for the playoffs. Now, adding people off the waiver wire is one way to do that, but the more direct way is through trades where everybody can win. Now, here are the guys you need to be targeting before week 9, because after that, their value might increase too high that he can't get them. And we'll start with a player we talked about last week, and his value has increased a little bit, but not high enough that you won't be able to trade for him. It is Javante Williams, who look. His snaps have now increased for 4 straight weeks, and let's look at what he's done these last couple of games. It's been impressive. In week 7, we saw Javante see a season high in usage. 53% of the snaps, 63% of the rush attempts. This was great, and just a reminder, he's coming off of a multi-ligament knee injury. He shouldn't even be playing right now in most years. If the medicine hadn't improved, then he didn't have a great recovery. And that great usage last week led to 96 yards, but he only scored 12.5 fantasy points because he didn't find the end zone. It made him a nice buy low last week. And his elite usage continued into this past week in week 9, where things got even better. Because Javante yet again set a season high in snaps. You can see right here from week 7 to week 8, they increased by 13%. He saw 66% of the snaps, and get this, 82% of the rush attempts. I mean, this is elite top 10 running back usage. It led to a massive, let me say this, and this is not a mistake, 30 opportunities, 27 carries, and 3 targets in this game for Javante. Between P. Ryan and Jaleel McLaughlin, his backups, they only saw 4 total carries. So Javante seems fully healthy, because why else would the coaches give him 19 opportunities last week and then 30 this week? Now check this out. Through 6 games, Javante ranks top 10 in breakaway runs and 2nd in yards after contact per attempt. And the most impressive part is he's been able to do that, remain efficient, despite seeing the 7th most stacked boxes this season. And Javante's upcoming schedule is pretty juicy, as you can see right here. He's going to be getting the Bills, the Vikings, and the Texans in 3 out of the next 4 weeks. They are bottom 10 defenses against the run. So trade for Javante before he starts scoring touchdowns and his fantasy points hit in the 20-plus point range. And you should also trade for the Chiefs wide receiver Rashee Rice, who once again saw his usage increase this past game, and it honestly wasn't expected to, because Justin Watson was a surprise active in week 9 for the Chiefs. He only missed 1 game after dislocating his elbow, and he was playing ahead of Rashee Rice before that injury, so the thought was, okay, maybe Rice is going to lose some work. And that would just really stink, because Rashee Rice, the 2nd-round rookie's usage was on the rise without Justin Watson. You saw 50% of the routes in week 6. That was a season high. And then he sets another season high in week 7 with 65% of the routes, finds a touchdown, has a nice big play over the middle of the field, continues to just put up double-digit fantasy points. So Watson's returning. This is going to ruin the usage, right? Wrong. The exact opposite happened. Because according to the PFF data right here, you can see Rashee Rice led the Chiefs wide receivers in snaps with 36. He had 27 routes, the 2nd most on the team, and he led the wide receivers with 5 targets. His strong usage continued as he was the clear wide receiver 1, honestly, yet again for Patrick Mahomes. Now, against a bad Broncos defense, we would have liked to see more here, especially on this usage. Just 4 catches for 56 yards, but it is not awful. And again, they only had 5 targets. And by the way, Patrick Mahomes apparently was fighting through the flu in this game, so it makes sense why he wasn't all that efficient. The offense had 5 turnovers. That's probably not going to happen yet again, or again this entire season. So basically, it was just a bad game. They were struggling to sustain drives on offense, but when you look a little bit closer into the data, it still wasn't all that awesome for the wide receivers in Rashee Rice. And we'll pull up the PFF data again, because look at this. 6 wide receivers saw at least 10 snaps in this game. Mecole Hardman saw a larger role, playing 21 snaps. We talked about Justin Watson. He returned and played 22 snaps. Who knows if his role ramps up in future weeks, another week removed from injury. So 6 wide receivers are used here, instead of in past weeks where it's like 4 to 5 guys are maybe involved when Hardman wasn't there, when Watson was hurt. So this is somewhat of a concern, because it only allowed Rashee Rice to play 60% of the snaps. But the one thing that we can say, out of all these wide receivers, it really only is Rashee Rice who's seeing a significant trend up during this time and is building a rapport with Mahomes. So he's trending in the right direction, and now he's going to get some nice game environments. You get a matchup at home against the Dolphins, should have a lot of points. You get a matchup against the Eagles, who give up a top 5 amount of points to fantasy wide receivers. The Chiefs and Packers are solid matchups, and if you keep looking here, the playoffs look really good. A bottom 10 Patriots secondary, a bottom half of the league Raiders secondary, and a bottom 10 Bengals secondary. So I'd be targeting Rashee Rice as soon as possible as a potential league winner down the stretch for you. Now, Deontay Johnson is also somebody I'm targeting, and I talked about it last week that he was skyrocketing up the rankings after returning and running 86% of the routes and earning 26% of the targets. Vintage Deontay. Now, the issue in his game last week for his fantasy points was that they only threw 25 times, and only 22 of those were catchable passes when you count the throwaways, so there just wasn't a lot of volume to go around. But that changed this past week, because Trubisky and Kenny Pickett combined for 43 pass attempts, and this is what happened when Mitch Trubisky came into the game. Kenny Pickett got hurt. They play on a short week on Thursday now, so who knows if he'll play. Trubisky targeted 5 different receivers, as Andrew points out here on Twitter. 5 different receivers 4 times, so it's not like he had any one happy player in this game that he was targeting a bunch, but we do have a larger sample of Trubisky dating back to last year with this offense. And now with that sample, Deontay Johnson actually does have some solid games. 13 fantasy points per game on 9 targets per game, and by the way, this was last year when he did not score any touchdowns, so this 13 points per game, even with just 1 or 2 touchdowns, touchdowns will be easily above 15 fantasy points per game. So I'm not worried about whichever quarterback plays here. Honestly, you could even argue that Mitch Trubisky might be a better option for Deontay. At least that's what the stats have shown in the past. Okay, so we talked about what happened in week 7. Things increased in week 8 where he looked fully healthy, got his full role. His routes increased to 98%, basically never left the field, and a 35% target share led this team. It was a massive day for Deontay, who saw more downfield usage and a massive 14 targets. Again, 4 of those were from Mitch Trubisky when he entered the game. And he also saw the only end zone target for this team in this game, and he didn't score a touchdown last year. He doesn't have one this year. Eventually, he's going to start to score some touchdowns, and then you won't be able to trade for him. And this is a guy that you want. Again, if you're one of the best teams in your league and you're like, why do I need to trade? It's for this reason right here. You're planning ahead for the fantasy playoffs. We'll have matchups against. Look at these teams right here. A bottom 5 Colts secondary, a bottom 5 Bengals secondary, and yeah, a bottom 5 Seahawks secondary. Deontay can easily start putting up 15 points a game in these matchups. So buy Deontay as soon as possible, and also hit the subscribe button as soon as possible, because 66% of people who watch these videos are not subscribed, and we're so close to 100,000 subscribers. That helps me out, but also lets you see my future content more easily. Now, another veteran receiver I want to talk about is DK Metcalf, who quietly had a strong usage day in week 8 returning from injury. Like Deontay Johnson, he saw 14 targets, and he turned these 14 targets into a solid game, especially given a tough matchup against Cleveland. 5 catches, 67 yards returning from injury, but only 12 fantasy points because he doesn't have a touchdown. But the 39% target share that he saw in this game from Geno Smith, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, was by far his largest on the season. He had no other games above 30%. This one was nearly 40%. As you can see right here, his targets per route run targeted on 41% of his routes was the second highest of his career. So this just shows that he's fully healthy, and finally, over all of the injuries, he's dealt with 4 different injuries this season dating back to week 1. So he's basically played the entire season hurt. This was his first game not hurt, and he sees a basically career high in targets per route run and a 39% target share. And the big fast receiver out of Ole Miss only continues to do what he does best, which is earn the cheat code targets in fantasy football, your deep targets and your red zone targets. Again, he's been playing injured this season. He missed a game this season. He has 15 cheat code targets, 8 deep and 7 red zone. This ranks top 12 in the NFL. And he also ranks 4th in the NFL in end zone targets, which means when you're standing in the end zone, you were targeted there, which means it's really easy to score touchdowns. It's also encouraging to see the Seahawks offense finally get all of their guys healthy and Geno Smith start to play good as well, at least for fantasy production. He sustained all 3 of the wide receivers for the first time this year, with Tyler Lockett going for over 80 yards and a touchdown, DK Metcalf having 14 targets, and Jackson Smith-Njigba for the second straight week finding the end zone. So DK is going to have some winnable matchups coming up against the Commanders and the Rams, but what you want him for is his elite playoff schedule, because the Seahawks are going to be getting the Eagles, the Titans, and the Steelers, which are all bottom 10 secondaries, which all give up top 8 fantasy points per game to wide receivers. And if your league is one of the leagues that plays their championship in week 18, the final week of the season, he'll get the Cardinals, who are the bottom 3rd or the 3rd worst secondary in the league. So either way, it's a good outlook for DK, who finally for the first time ever this season was healthy last week. Go get him and this next second-year receiver. And that man's name is Chris Olave for the Saints, who we talked about it last week. He was in this video. He's one of the most frustrating fantasy players this season, but a lot of it isn't for his reasons, or at least his fault. Because like we mentioned last week, for about half the season, Derek Carr has been battling this shoulder injury. He seemed finally over it last week. But that shoulder injury made Derek Carr a lot less efficient downfield and overall, and like you saw in week 7 on Thursday Night Football, 15 targets only turned into 12 fantasy points because most of these weren't catchable from Derek Carr. And the frustrations only continued for Chris Olave fantasy owners in week 8. Because as you can see from the game log right here, Derek Carr had a good game. He only threw 27 times. He averaged 11.5 yards per attempt. That's crazy. He had over 300 yards, again, on only 19 completions. But if you scroll here, it was only in this game 46 yards for Chris Olave on a nice 9 targets. But how did they get there? Well, they got there from Rashid Shaheed having a massive game. He had 3 catches for 153 yards. Michael Thomas just kept doing what he was doing, 68 yards. And Alvin Kamara kept catching checkdowns for 51 yards. So it's kind of a fluky game where about half of Derek Carr's yards came on 3 receptions to Rashid Shaheed. So yet again, Chris Olave doesn't get there, just 46 yards, no touchdowns, but he sees a 31% target share, his best that he's seen in over a month. He just continues to get peppered with targets in this offense, and his average depth of target downfield in this game was 17 yards, which will lead to big plays like we saw for Shaheed this past week. According to Pro Football Focus expected points model, Chris Olave is the number 2 buy low candidate right now, which basically just means that based on the usage that he's seeing, he's expected to earn a lot more points. He's going to bounce back soon. Like we mentioned, Derek Carr's shoulder is a big reason for this, and just in general, he's getting unlucky with his targets right now. He ranks 81st in catchable targets. Only 63% of his targets are catchable, which means more than a third of them, 37%, are not catchable. Now, this should improve as Derek Carr continues to get even healthier, and just in general, it'll balance out because when Carr's targeting other receivers, he has been a lot more accurate than this. Now, the good news is we are getting the cheat code targets for Olave like we talked about with DK Metcalf. These deep targets and red zone targets, he leads the NFL in deep targets. That's going to eventually lead to some big plays with 18, and he has a solid 7 red zone targets, 3 red zone receptions. That's top 20. Overall, he is top 8 in this metric. So expect more big plays for Olave coming soon, and also you want him because of his schedule. The upcoming schedule is really nice against some of these secondaries. The Bears, he's going to get at home a bottom 10 secondary. The Vikings is a plus matchup for him. And when you scroll a little bit more, matchups against bottom 10 secondaries in the Giants and Panthers. So try and buy low on Chris Olave and this next running back who has been just as frustrating. And that'll be Tony Pollard, who heading out of the bye week got a nice matchup against the Rams. This was a game where the Cowboys scored 43 points and they won by 23. So you're saying to yourself, oh, Pollard must have gone off. Well, no. Pollard only ends up putting up 6.5 fantasy points, 13 touches for 55 yards. He wasn't all that efficient. And yet again, he frustrates his fantasy owners. The Cowboys defense, they had 43 points, yes, but the Cowboys defense special teams accounts for 2 of those touchdowns. So it was a little bit skewed yet again. Another blowout for the Cowboys. Where Tony Pollard doesn't play the fourth quarter. He gets pulled at the beginning of the fourth quarter, basically sits the entire one. And it's Rico Dowdle playing the final 9 drives, the final 3 drives, and having the only 3 carries in the fourth quarter for the Cowboys. So now if you look at Tony Pollard's game logs over the past month, his recent one isn't yet updated in here, but it was 6.5 fantasy points. You would have 6.5 fantasy points down here. Then he had a nice game before the bye of 17 points, but then just 8.4 and 9. So really over the last 5 weeks, because of that bye week, he's only been productive in fantasy one time, which is definitely going to start frustrating his fantasy owners. But I want to say, if you have him, hold him. Don't sell low or sell him away right now. And if you don't have him, well, that's the point of this video. Let's buy him. Because his usage remains strong. His role is fantastic. Right now, he ranks 5th in expected fantasy points per game based on his role, but only 11th in actual fantasy points. So he is expected to be a top 5 running back, if not better. And that has to do with this elite role, as you can see right here. He ranks 2nd in red zone touches. Right now, he has the 2nd most red zone touches, but only 2 touchdowns this year. That's eventually going to balance out. Running backs with 35 touches to 40 like he has this season are earning 4 to 5 touchdowns instead of the 2 that he has. And now this is the big concern with Pollard. It's his efficiency, as Dwayne McFarland points out from a next-gen stats. Based on the overall carries and touches he has, his yards that he's expected to get, he currently ranks 5th worst next to guys like Latavius Murray and Dalvin Cook. Older running backs who are less efficient, have less bursts than him, which is a concern that he's not picking up these yards in situations where he should. Now you can say that there are some reasons for this. You can say that it was the first month of the season. The Cowboys offensive line dealt with not 1, not 2, but 3 injuries. Maybe that's part of it. But some of these things are also factored into the expected yards that you were supposed to be picking up. And then the other part that you can say is, well, it's a small sample of just about 4 to 5 bad games. And in a situation like this where I'm trying to buy low for a fantasy playoff push, I'm okay to say, yeah, you know what, the 5-game sample where he hasn't been all that great, or the 4-game sample where he hasn't been all that great, I'm okay to take the larger one over the past years where we've seen him be highly efficient. So assuming his role stays the same, and it should, nobody's really pushing him for touches, I want to buy low on Pollard and expect the efficiency to bounce back. I'd also like to grab Mike Evans off of a down week, because overall this season his usage has been solid. Because Evans has been averaging 8.2 targets per game. He is 10th in downfield usage and 16th in expected fantasy points. And none of that takes into account the fact that he lost 40 to 50% of the snaps in week 4 when he left early with injury against the Saints. Now Evans started the season strong, as you can see right here in his game logs on Player Profiler, over 18 points, 29 and 17. But since week 3, he's only had 1 game, which was right here, his last game out before in week 7, before this past week's Thursday night game. He's only had 1 game over 13 points. So over the past 5 weeks, when you take into the bye week, he's only had 1 serviceable week for you in fantasy. And maybe serviceable is a little bit harsh. He did have 12.9 fantasy points last week on Thursday Night Football. He got there kind of luckily just on 1 deep touchdown. Because his usage in that game honestly just wasn't good. He only had a 14% target share, by far a season low. This was less than Chris Godwin got, whose targets have been going up while we've seen Evans go down the last 3 weeks. But I still want to be buying Mike Evans, because for the most part this season he's been great. And maybe he's been dealing with a little bit of that hamstring injury still, because he came back in 2 weeks when it usually takes 3 to 4. And as you can see right here, his role is great. He ranks 16th in expected fantasy points. So basically his overall role is the 16th best based on his usage, and 14th in fantasy points per game. So this is pretty close, meaning that the usage that he's getting, it's sustainable for the production he's putting up. It's not like he's overproducing. So I'd buy low on him because he has some nice matchups coming up against the Texans, the Titans, and the Colts. And then he has some juicy spots in the fantasy playoffs if you were to scroll here against teams like Jacksonville and the Packers to start those playoffs. So grab Mike Evans and this next asset. And that'll be the fantasy blueprint, which if you want to make your fantasy playoffs and take home a fantasy championship, this is for you. Thousands of people are currently using it. Every day of the week, I send you a different tool, the waiver wire tiers, rest of season rankings, game by game notes, everything right here to help you do just that win your league. And here is a snippet from this past week's game by game matchup notes. You can go game by game, or you can filter by position. This is the wide receiver position. I have every single cornerback wide receiver matchup, what that cornerback has allowed, where the weight and speed advantages for the wide receiver or cornerback, what the wide receiver has done that year. This is just a snippet of one thing that you get at one position. And it's really easy to get. You just scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description below. Now, when you click that link or scan the QR code, it'll take you to this page. You follow these 2 simple steps and check this out. It is only $5 for the entire season. And if you don't make your fantasy playoffs, I just refund that $5, making this completely risk-free. You either make your fantasy playoffs and take your march for a fantasy championship, or you get your $5 back. So to get access to your fantasy blueprint today, just scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description below. Now, the next guy I want you to trade for, if he's not available on your waiver wire, he's available in like 50, 40% of leagues or so, depending on when you're watching this. I would just go pick him up. But if he's already picked up, try and trade for Chuba Hubbard. Hubbard because he only had 7 fantasy points this past week, which maybe makes people not realize how good his role was. Because we were told heading into this game that he would see an increased role, but he saw much more than that. That was an understatement. Because not only did his role increase with Miles Sanders returning, but he saw the running back 1 usage. In week 8, he plays 66% of the snaps and handles 71% of the rush attempts. And he was used in all situations, saw 50% of the passing down snaps and 100% of the 2-minute offense work over Sanders. And unlike previous weeks where Miles Sanders was banged up, Sanders came into this game without an injury designation, meaning that they chose to go with the more efficient back in Hubbard over him. And here's what Hubbard has done this year. Last year, he was top 5 in yards per touch and running back efficiency. This year, it's gone a little bit down as he's seen some more usage, but still top 20 in true yards per carry, and he's averaging 4.5 yards per touch when you factor in his receiving work. So now maybe there's a chance Miles Sanders, even though he didn't say that he had an injury and was put on the injury report, maybe he just kept that information to himself so he can play in this game. There's still that chance that he's playing through something. And we'll find that out as the weeks go on, but if that's not the case, well, they're just giving Chuba Hubbard the role here. They've already changed some coaches and the play callers, so they're saying, yeah, we're just going to go with the best players. And as Adam Levitan points out here, they gave a lot of money to Miles Sanders relative to the position. $13 million, and less than a year later, they're already going to Chuba Hubbard, who this past week had 17 opportunities and touches to just 2 for Miles Sanders. So I'd be buying low on Chuba Hubbard, or like I said, if he's available like he is in 30 to 40% of leagues, he probably shouldn't be available in any 10 to 12 man league now. Well, go add him, otherwise trade for him. And this one might be a little bit harder to get a deal done here, but this is maybe your best week to do so. It's Kenneth Walker, who's coming off of a bad week 8 performance. Because in week 8, he sees a season low 44% of the snaps and only handles 44% of the rushing attempts for this team. Now, there was no reported injuries in this game for Walker, but it basically just came down to, from what I can see, they only ran 17 rushing plays to 37 passing plays. And we saw the rookie Zach Charbonnet relatively get more involved in terms of only having 17 rush attempts in the game. Well, he had 5 of them for 53 yards. He continues to be extremely efficient and added a couple of receptions here. 7 total touches for 64 yards. Had his most rushing percentages, 31% of the carries of the year. Now, look, I don't believe that Kenneth Walker is losing his job here. He's had a great season, and in this game, he averaged over 8 yards per carry. I just view this as a random week where they didn't run the ball a lot, and based on game flow, we saw Zach Charbonnet get 5 carries to just 8 for Walker. But maybe the owner in your league will see that Kenneth Walker only had 8 fantasy points. He was recently on bye week, so he didn't really do much for him then, and he doesn't really remember all the good times he had earlier this year with Walker. He sees that Zach Charbonnet's more involved. This could be a chance to at least get a deal in the works. But after watching this video, you know that he is still a great asset. He's averaging over 16 fantasy points per game. Heading into this game, he was averaging 17.5 points per game and never had less than 10.7 points in any of these contests. His role remains elite. He is still top 3 in red zone usage this season, so I would go and get him as soon as possible. And I would also try and trade for Garrett Wilson, because all this guy has done is see insane volume this season and over the past month. Just check it out. Over the past 4 games, Wilson has earned 13 targets, 7 targets, 12 targets, and 13 targets. He ranks 2nd in targets per game, tied with Tyreek Hill during this time and only behind Stephon Diggs. His usage has resulted in a wild 35% of the targets during this time, and in his past 2 games, he's had a 38% and 39% target share. Both of those would easily lead the NFL last season. Now, of course, the downside still remains the same. It's that Zach Wilson continues to struggle, because Zach Wilson only completed 17 of 36 passes against a bad Giants secondary. That's just 47% completion rate. But we're still seeing the heavy targets, a 39% target share, like we said last week for Garrett Wilson, which even on bad games for Zach Wilson can still get him there. And we saw exactly this against the Giants, where Garrett Wilson went for over 20 fantasy points because of the volume. Garrett now ranks 24th in fantasy points per game, and he has the 15th best role. So there's a little bit of improvement here, a room for improvement. If his quarterback can play better, maybe they get a different quarterback. Probably unlikely by the time the trade deadline, but maybe by the time you're watching this, they do. Or if we can just see some more touchdowns go his way. So try and trade for Garrett Wilson, who was a lot easier to buy maybe 6 weeks ago, right before or right after Aaron Rodgers' injury, but you can still get him at a fair price. And I just want to throw a reminder out there about James Conner. We talked about him last week. He still has 1 more game on the injured reserve, but then he comes back, and he was averaging 18 opportunities per game before injury, and Kyler Murray might be coming back the exact same week as James Conner, which could lead to more potential red zone touches and touchdowns. So these are the players you should trade for before week 9 if you want to improve your team, no matter what your record is. And the other way to improve your team is the waiver wire, and to see who you should be targeting on the waiver wire this week, and maybe they're still available out there even after your waivers clear, well, check out this video right here. If you made it to the end, make sure you're not one of the 66% of people who are not subscribed to the channel. It takes 2 seconds. It helps me, and it also helps you see my future content.